Bruce Lee once said, "I fear not the man who knows 10,000 different kicks, but I fear the man who knows one kick and has practiced it 10,000 times." Now, I'm not a kung fu master, but I think what Bruce Lee was trying to say was that it's not just good enough to know many things and not be able to do them well. It's better, in fact, to know just one thing, but to have practiced it and know it and to have mastered it, especially in the field of martial arts. Well, I think reading our Bibles can be like that as well. Especially the Old Testament. We can see it as a compilation of 10,000 different stories, right? Many, many, many different stories. And it is true because these are written over hundreds of years by many different authors to different contexts, to different people, and they are separate stories. But it's very easily that we can be overwhelmed by all the difference in the stories, the variety of the stories. And so I hope one of the things that you've been getting is that it's not just about different stories, but really there's one story here. First of all, there's one overarching story that God is telling in the Old Testament, flowing into the New Testament, into Jesus Christ. But more than that, I hope you're also hearing that even from story to story to story, really, in a sense, they are the same story. What I mean is that there's a theme running through each of these stories that we're talking about. And that theme has to do with obedience. Obedience to Jesus, to the Lord, Yahweh, as our King. And as we hear these stories repeated over and over again, I hope that'll give us a chance to practice these stories. Not just to hear them, but also to practice them in our hearts, in our lives, so that this obedience becomes almost second nature to us, more natural than unnatural to us. Think of the Old Testament also like a screw that's gradually tightening as it gets further and further deeper into the wood. Like when you first put a screw into a piece of wood, it's kind of wobbly, it can fall out very easily. But as you turn it, as you tighten it, you're not just going around in circles and circles and spinning. It's going deeper and deeper and deeper. The Old Testament, I think, is also like that. As we read through the Old Testament, as we hear the stories over and over again, they're not just repetition, but they also clarifying for us more and more who God is, what he's been about in Israel, and what he wants to be about today. Well, with the idea of kingship in Samuel today, we come really close to the center of the theology of the Old Testament. Okay, here's my outline for the next half hour. First, I want to unpack a little bit the historical context of this part of the book of Samuel. And then, second, I want to talk about that theme, kingship and obedience. Again, right? That one kick 10,000 times. Third, I want to talk about the idea of God's accommodation, this idea of God's accommodation to us. He meets us even in our failures. And fourth, I want to take some time to respond by talking about application and giving us some time to think, reflect, and to pray together. Okay, so historical context. Last week, Edith led us through the conquest and into the promised land, into the time of the judges. It's a very dark time, and it ends with that line. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king over Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, to understand the political situation of Israel during this period, imagine Israel not really as a nation, but really as a group of tribes loosely associated with one another in this land called Canaan. So we can't think of Israel at that time like a real nation. So we can't think of it like Canada or the United States or Australia or Britain or something like that. You might think of it as a developing nation or an emerging nation. Or if you want to take an analogy from history, think of it like Canada pre-Confederation, okay? This is 1867 Canada, a map of it. And it looks nothing like the political geography, the boundaries look nothing like what it looks like today. But that's what it looked like in 1867. Just a loose kind of association of British colonies and some provinces. And the names were even different before 1867. These are the names that were given at Confederation in 1867. But looks nothing like what Canada is today, right? There's no central government. There's no capital city. Think of Israel in the time of the Judges and early Samuel like that, okay? They were not yet organized politically. 12 tribes spread across the land, centered on some of these city-states in Palestine, in Canaan. The people were essentially loosely organized in those city-states. But through these circumstances of that time, God provided leadership for them in the form of judges. Now, judges were not simply people who made decisions in the law court for legal matters, but in that context, historical context, there were also military leaders. There were also political leaders. There were also spiritual leaders. Now, the judges here in this map, there's the placement of the different judges that are told in the stories in the book of Judges. The judges would not have governed over the entire nation of Israel. Probably they would have governed over their location, their city-state, their geographical locale. God would have raised them up when some kind of opposition arose during that time and they had need, and God would raise them up. So it's not as if these judges were governing over a unified Israel that had one political, military, spiritual agenda. So this statement, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. On one level, it's a very practical description of what was going on. That's the state of affairs generally of the people during that historical period in terms of its political organization, in terms of its military organization, as well as in its spiritual organization. But God worked within these circumstances to provide the leadership that they needed. And as the book of Samuel opens, the historical situation begins to change. And one of the most important changes is that the Philistines now become the dominant enemy, political enemy for them in this land. The Philistines, they were one of the many enemies during the period of the Judges as well, but they then in Samuel become the dominant enemy, the main enemy against Israel for three main reasons. The first one was because they were one of the first peoples to use iron. So this is the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, in which people were transitioning to using iron. Iron is a superior metal to bronze, to these alloys, and it was harder, it was stronger. So the weapons that they would be able to create with iron were superior weapons. The Philistines actually sourced much of that iron and were controlling much of that iron. And so they were able to take advantage and master that technology earlier. A second form of technology are chariots. We heard it in our readings today. Really, that reflected kind of a later development for Israel. They didn't master or pick up the technology of chariots until later on, but the Philistines were able to adopt those very early on in their military use. And here's an iron chariot. So combining iron and chariots, especially in the plateaus in that lower region of between the Mediterranean and Jordan River, these chariots were extremely effective. And so they had these advantages. The third advantage they had, probably the most significant of them, was that they were able to, despite their also being localized in different city-states and governed via various leaders in city-states, they were able to organize themselves and unify themselves militarily very, very well. So despite the fact that they didn't also have a king per se, they were able to organize themselves and amass large armies, sophisticated armies, and be able to therefore conquer the other groups of people around them. And they were the largest threat to Israel at this time. So that gives us some context in terms of this passage, or these passages that we've read, especially that first one. From a purely human perspective, Israel's request then for a king was not unreasonable. Actually, it made perfect sense, didn't it? Give us a king. Life had gotten more complex. Their enemies had grown stronger, more advanced. They needed more unified leadership across the land in this new setting, in this new situation. But listen to what the text says about their reasons. Verse 5. Now appoint for us a king to judge us, like all the nations. And then again, verse 20, after Samuel warns them about what this king is going to be like, or what kings will be like in the future for them, and prophesies over them, how do they respond? They say, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. You see, it's not the request itself which was so wrong. Really, it was a motivation for that request, just like all the nations. Had they forgotten God's commandments to them to be holy, to be set apart from the nations, to be special, to be different from the nations? Had they forgotten that they were to be God's special treasured possession in all the world, to be a light to the nations? Had they forgotten how they had conquered Jericho? Was it by military force and military power? No, we heard last week, marching around this greatly fortified city, perhaps the greatest fortified city in the ancient world, 7 times. What kind of military strategy is that? With an ark, the ark of God, 7 times, and blowing a trumpet or blowing trumpets after that 7th round. It's not a very wise military strategy, is it? The lesson was, it's not about military power, it's about trusting and obeying God. Had they forgotten about Egypt, how God had brought them out? Was it through armies, vast armies, that they conquered the most powerful nation at that time? No, they did nothing. It was all God. It was God who rescued them. All they did was be rescued. So God says to them, when Samuel goes to God in prayer with the people's request, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Do you hear this story again and again and again, right? From Genesis 1 on through here in 1 Samuel. The problem has been the same. God's intention with his people is that they be his people and that he be their God. That they be his representatives on this earth, his representatives. And so they'll represent his interests, his character, his love, his righteousness, to bear his image. Israel thinks that this is a human problem that they're facing in the 10th century BC. They think that it's a human problem, it's a military problem, it's a political problem. But God wants them to understand, no, it's not a human problem, it's a spiritual problem that they're actually facing. It's not these external problems which are the problem. It's the main problem underlying all of it. And that's our basic problem too, isn't it? That's our problem too. We keep wanting to be king over our own lives. We don't want God to be our king. We don't want him to tell us what to do and how to live our lives. We don't want to listen to someone else. We want to be our own Lord, our own king. We often go through life trying to fix our own life's problems from one life stage to another stage to another stage. So I remember when I was a teenager, it's a long time ago now, but I still remember, I thought my big problem was being accepted, being in the right crowd, having the right friends, being popular. So my prayer was, God, make me popular, make me like them, make me be accepted like my friends. What God was trying to teach me during that phase was, Sam, don't look to your popularity or your social group for your identity. Look to me. Be accepted by me. Let that be your identity. And as a young adult, I remember wanting to find someone to spend my life with. But instead of taking that desire to God, I took things into my own hands and sought relationships myself. What God wanted to teach me was that I'm not alone. Even when I feel like I'm alone, I am not alone. God is with me. It's not so much of whether God is with me or not, but whether I'm aware of his presence with me, whether I'm in tune with his voice with me and his presence with me. He is with me. That's what he was trying to teach me. Today, he's teaching me some other things, like you have some life experience now, you have some years under your belt, some wisdom, some gifting, some calling, but don't trust in those alone. Don't depend on those alone. Depend on me. Trust in me. Don't forget me. Listen to me. That's what's really important. Don't forget to obey me. So yes, friends are good. Yes, relationship is good. Yes, doing well in your area of work is good. All these things are good, right? We buy houses, cars, we amass, we accumulate things. These things are all good. But God wants to say to us that he wants to be at the very center of our lives. He wants to be our identity. He wants us to know that we are not alone because he is with us. He wants our work to be all centered, no matter what it is that we're doing, about him, giving it to him. We go about our lives often trying to fix these little problems in our lives, and our world often calls this success or just living life. But God is not interested in us being successful in the world's terms. He wants to fix that bigger problem in our lives, to let him be king in our hearts. Does God really care about our little problems? That's the question I want to ask next. So we're moving into this third part of my outline, God's accommodation. Does God really care about our everyday problems, about us having friends and partners, fulfilling work, and so on? Does he? Well, just read the text that we had read out to us today. Of course he does. Yes, absolutely he does. If there's one thing that comes out clearly in the text, it's that God cares about his people's problems. I mean, what does he do? This is what theologians call accommodation, right? So the people have this sense of their need before God, and they say, we need a king just like the other nations around us. And then God realizes that actually that's not the real problem. The problem is that you don't want me to be your king. You want to be your own king. And what does he do? Does he kind of smite them and rain fire down on them and do away with them, start all over? No. Actually, what he does is he accommodates to their needs. In fact, it's almost as if God changes his plans to accommodate the needs of the people, right? Meanwhile, he's working out his greater plans in history still. But he changes his immediate plans and accommodates to the people's request. He actually tells Samuel, provide a king for them. Now, he's actually bending his will to the people so that they can actually have their needs met, or at least their perceived needs met. In fact, that is the main reason for God sending Jesus into this world. We call this also the incarnation. God is accommodating to our level. God is on a mission to reach us right where we're at. He knows right where we're at. He sends Jesus to our midst, right to our sinful, broken world, to experience the same thing. He's on a mission to reach us where we're at. But in order to do that, he descends to our level. That's accommodation. Even if we're misguided, even if we're disobedient, even if our motivations aren't all correct, right? But something else we see in this text is that even though God accommodates to his people's request and his people's needs in a way that he wouldn't have, he also does not shelter them from their disobedience. He doesn't shelter them from their request. And so Samuel appoints for them a king, Saul. Saul starts off kind of well, but he turns bad pretty quickly. He's filled with rage and jealousy as David starts arising on the scene. And in fact, his life ends in tragedy. Suicide on the battlefield. And then skip over David's life to the many kings that follow David, and Samuel's prophecies come true. King after king after king. It's this gradual decline, which we'll see next week. The kings leading their people into further idolatry, into disobedience. God did not protect his people, shelter his people from the consequences of their choices, of their decision. God did accommodate to their situation. He does care for them, but he also doesn't shelter them from the natural consequences of their decisions. But I wonder, if we could truly learn to trust God and obey him, we could probably spare ourselves a lot of pain, a lot of grief. I wonder if God's people actually came to Samuel at that point and had said to him instead what they did. They said, Samuel, we submit to your leadership, and God, we want to follow you as king, but look at the nations around us. We are scared. Help us. Rescue us. We don't know what to do. We want you to be our king, and we remember what you've done for us. I wonder what God would have done. I wonder if he would have provided them a king anyway, because he knows what it is that they need and what's good for them. And I wonder if history wouldn't have gone a completely different way. Not so much pain and suffering. He cares about us. He cares about his people, and he will look after us. But he wants to do it in his way. He needs to do it in his way because he is God and not us. Now, the really amazing thing about how this story ends, and we see a glimpse of it in that second reading in 2 Samuel. Yes, God accommodates to his people's sinfulness and disobedience and puts even his own plans aside for the time being while he's working out his greater plan. But after Saul fails, there is another king, King David. And David is righteous. David is obedient. Now, he's not perfect by any means. He is not perfect by any means. But where he succeeds is in trusting and obeying God even when things are difficult in his life. And things sure were difficult in his life, especially in the first part of his life, before he was king. as he was persecuted by Saul, yet he continued to trust and obey God. And I think the story that most illustrates that is the story of when Saul is in the cave alongside him. So Saul goes into the cave by himself to relieve himself, and David happens to be hiding in that cave. So there is Saul. He's vulnerable, he's exposed, he's alone. He doesn't know that David is there. Saul's been persecuting and chasing David. And David at that point could very easily have taken matters into his own hands, right? Taken vengeance, protect his own life, secure his own fate. He knows that he's going to be the king. He's been anointed by God through Samuel to be the next king. He knows he's the heir to the throne of Israel. But he doesn't. Because the timing of that transition is not in his hands. He also knows that Saul is also a God's anointed. And Saul is in God's hands, not his. And so he doesn't take matters into his own hands. Instead, he continues to trust in God's timing and obey God. Under David's kingship, the nation finally is united. They defeat all their enemies and the nation prospers. And then there's this promise that we had read out to us in 2 Samuel. And this comes in the context of actually David, there's peace on all sides of his borders. And he says, now I want to build a house for God. He sees that God's still in the midst of this sanctuary, this temple, the tabernacle. And he says, I want to build a permanent house for God. And then God turns around and says, no, you're not going to build a house for me. I'm going to build your house, David. Not just a house, but an everlasting kingdom. And notice it's not just a temporal promise here, but one that lasts forever. Listen to what God says about this descendant of David to come. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. And as I mentioned, we know that the descendants of David actually aren't that great. In fact, David is the high water mark in the spiritual life of the kings of Israel. David is a high water mark, and it kind of just goes downhill from there. So this is not one of David's direct heirs and descendants. The promise is not pointing to one of them. The promise is pointing forwards to Jesus. 1,000 years before Jesus comes on the scene. But what's happening in Scripture is this screw, right, is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. This is what God has been doing all along. This is what God's intentions has been all along in this big picture of things. He wants to send a king into this world who represents his interests, his heart, his character, so that human beings can look like him, so that we can actually become like him. And that's how this story ends in the New Testament. And that should give us great, great hope. That even in our failures, God is working out some kind of history. He's working up some kind of greater purpose that is in his history and in his purposes greater than ours. Okay. That is the biblical exposition of 1 and 2 Samuel that we'll have today. So I know we're going quickly, but I want to take some time now just to think about and reflect on, apply some of these truths to our lives. And I have, first of all, 3 questions for you to reflect on and think about, where in your life you might benefit from surrendering, continuing to surrender your life to God, areas in your life. So 3 questions, then 3 suggestions. So take some time now, take stock of your own life, kind of settle down, have these stories in the back of your mind as we enter into a different kind of a posture here. Think about your own life. First of all, where are you trying to find solutions to your own problems? Where are you trying to find solutions to your own problems? Like, where are you tempted to strategize your way out instead of seeking God's guidance? And maybe especially for those who are problem solvers, right? People who like to solve problems like me. Where are those places that you're really tempted just to think about how I'm going to solve this problem in my life instead of seeking God's guidance? Okay, second, where do you try to control things? Where do you try to control things instead of trusting in God's timing? You know, sometimes things don't really fit in life, but you try to control things to make it fit. Where in your life today, trying to control things instead of trusting in God's timing? And thirdly, where do you feel pressure to conform? Conform to be like the world around you instead of looking to God? Instead of looking to God. Okay, so let me close with this challenge. So when you face a decision or a problem in these areas in your life that hopefully you've had a moment to reflect on and that the Holy Spirit is bringing to mind, I want to suggest 3 things. First, slow down, pause, and pray. So this week, as you're going through life, maybe there's some kind of situation in your life, you go, oh, there's this problem in my life. It's happened again. Instead of just thinking about how you're going to solve that problem, stop and pray. And then acknowledge that God is your king in that situation. Okay? So first is pause and pray. Second is like it. Think about what would following Jesus look like in that situation. As you pause and you pray, you acknowledge God as your king, think about what would following Jesus, allegiance to Jesus, look like in that situation. And then thirdly, expand your vision, right? Don't just think about that immediate moment and what it is that you're looking for, what it is that you're needing in that moment. But what might God be trying to do in the greater purpose of your life and perhaps those around you? So pause and pray. Give God acknowledgement. Think about what Jesus would do. And think about the larger arc of your life and what God's purpose might be for you. In other words, it's this kind of the same lesson again about obedience. Like the same kick 10,000 times, right? Okay, hopefully we'll get really good at it and eventually become second nature to us. Jesus being our king, he's the one that we want to learn to trust and obey in all our circumstances.